Hello and welcome to Empiresofhistorypodcast The Ottomans. I am Frank, your host. If you would like to reach out to me, the best way to do so is to shoot me an email at empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. As you may know, this show has taken yet another hiatus, but I want all of my listeners to know that what keeps me coming back were the emails that I kept receiving, and I will be reading some of those out in a future episode. But for now, in the show news, I would like to let you know that there is now a YouTube version of this show. Don't worry, it's not a direct carbon copy of the podcast. What you'll find if you check out Empires of History, the Ottomans YouTube link, are short videos I've made, and they touch on various aspects of the empire in no particular order. There is a link in the show notes below, and please, I invite you to check it out. Death of Sultan Mehmed I, the ascension of Murad II, and an Ottoman naval defeat at Gallipoli in the year 1416. Episode 17. When writing episodes 15 and 16, I neglected to mention a very important event about midway through Sultan Mehmed's reign. The Ottomans, you see, suffered a major naval defeat off the Gallipoli Peninsula in 1416. And I'll tell you this, I went back and forth on whether to include it or not, for the simple reason that it almost seemed irrelevant to the narration that I was building. However, as I continued to dig into this and do additional research, I noticed that the consequences for the Ottomans and their Western opponents, well, they would reap a lot of really bad things in the future because of this naval action. So I'm going to lay it all out. To begin with, let's start up with the setup. Taking the throne in 1413, Mehmed had commissioned several of his personal bodyguard officers as naval ship captains. They had the authority and funds to construct and staff a fleet. For almost a century now, if you recall, the Ottomans had been relying upon the will of the Byzantines and Venetians in order to ferry themselves to and fro from Europe and Anatolia. Now sure, the Ottomans could manage to cross the straits themselves, but as we saw during the Ottoman Civil War period, they could only do so in really small numbers. The fleets of Venice and the Byzantines could easily move entire armies, much larger than the Ottomans, back and forth in much shorter time and with better protection. Plus, as the Ottomans expanded, they realized that allowing the Venetians and Byzantines control of the eastern Mediterranean, especially the Dardanelles Straits, well, it's not exactly a long-term survival strategy. So Mehmed's captains went about recruiting sailors, most of whom, and this will come up later, were actually Christians, but they had the experience of sailing in Western navies. In short order, the Ottomans had managed to assemble a fleet of between 30 and 55 vessels, depending on how you count them. By 1415, the Ottoman navy had raided several trading outposts belonging to the Venetians, and they even managed to overrun some outlying Byzantine lands. Now, some of these lands were simply isolated islands, but the Ottoman fleet was now, no pun intended, making waves. And pretty soon, there occurred a financial strain on Venice, and various Italian states began to worry. It should be pointed out that despite Venice constantly represented as a naval power at this time in history, the Republic actually didn't have a dedicated, what we would consider, full-time military navy. If trouble happened to show up over the horizon, then they would come together and they would commission experienced boat captains and sailors, load up their hulls with mercenaries, and well, just kind of hope for the best. The Venetian Doge commissioned an experienced sailor, and his name was Pietro Loredan, with orders to transport a delegation of ambassadors. After all, let's sit down and try and talk with Sultan Mehmed and see if some type of agreement could be worked out. Most of what we know at this point about the battle, it comes from Lordan himself, writing years after the conflict. When I was researching this episode for some good Ottoman sources, to be quite honest, I just couldn't really find anything. So we need to take everything we are about to hear with a grain of salt. The Venetian fleet, it is reported, approached the Ottoman naval base at Gallipoli on the 29th of May, 1416. Lordan ordered an advance squadron to approach the base and signal that they were carrying ambassadors. The customary protocol of the day would allow them to pass through the Dardanelles, which at this time the Ottomans securely controlled. However, from the Ottoman standpoint, all they must have saw was a squadron of 4 to 5 ships, heavily armed and headed straight at them. Lordan then tells us that the Ottomans opened fire, forcing his squadron to withdraw. Not seeking to escalate things, the captain ordered the rest of his fleet to drop ore and get the hell out of there. However, the Ottomans sent light ore ships to trail Lordan's fleet as he tried to turn around. The two sides maneuvered throughout the night, and the next day it looked as though a showdown was bound to happen. But, well, something strange occurred, and this is where, to be honest with you, I'm a little confused about how the battle actually begun. Lordan casually mentioned in his account that he made contact with the Ottoman authorities, and they assured him his ambassadors would have safe passage. But as he approached Gallipoli, the Ottoman navy appeared and began firing. So whatever happened about the night before with the two sides maneuvering against each other, this has remained unresolved to this day. But whatever happened leading up to the battle, on May 30th, the two sides collided in battle. Lordan says that the quicker-moving Venetian ships outmaneuvered the larger Ottoman galleys, and they managed to board several Ottoman vessels, and the well-armed Venetian mercenaries fought bitterly from one Ottoman vessel to another. Eventually, Lordan's forces fought their way to a crippled Ottoman galley that happened to be the flagship of the enemy admiral himself. This Ottoman officer would die in the fighting. The rest of the Ottoman fleet, now whittled down to a mere dozen or so ships after this engagement, they broke off and headed as fast as they could to the safety of the Gallipoli fortress. The Venetians had succeeded in capturing many Ottoman ships and prisoners. In a particular act of inhuman brutality, the Venetians, remember those Christian sailors that had enlisted with the Ottomans? They took all the captives and killed every single Christian among them. Talk about Christian love right there. For the next few years, the Ottomans and Venetians would skirmish here and fight there. But the end result was a peace treaty signed in 1419 by Mehmed I, in which the Sultan would acknowledge Venetian naval supremacy, and his successors respected for the next several decades. So, this Battle of Gallipoli in 1416 is important for two main reasons for us. The first is that it showed both the strength and weakness of the Ottomans in putting together a fleet. On the one hand, they had huge numbers of supplies, money, shipbuilding capabilities, weapons, and money. But on the other hand, crewing them with experienced sea captains to command their vessels and first officers to act as backups were always in short supply. In other words, the technical skills to properly build up a navy was lacking. Second, the Venetians, as well as the broader powers within Christian Europe, after this battle in 1416, they would acknowledge the Ottomans as a formidable, almost unstoppable force on land, as the Crusade of Nicopolis had proved. But when it came to the sea, that was an entirely different matter. And this perception of the Ottomans as being a paper tiger at sea, or paper sea dragon, would have disastrous consequences for Christian Europe on down the line, especially during the reigns of Mehmed II, and latter sultans who would build a fully capable and threatening navy. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's pick up where episode 16 left off. Ever conscious of the need for a successor, yet the appalling lack of formal law or protocol in actually choosing who the next sultan would be, Mehmed I was left in a bit of a dilemma. On the one hand, he had two sons, the elder of which was Murad, soon to be Murad II. Should Sultan Mehmed I die without a well-thought-out plan of succession, well, there were always those three princes in captivity held in Constantinople. And don't think for one moment their young ages didn't mean that they weren't capable of swinging behind them huge swaths of support. And should they make a play for the Sultanate, I can only imagine the turmoil the empire would be plunged into. I'm not going to jump into the weeds of who Mehmed's concubines and wives were, but suffice it to say that it was a complex web of dynastic power dynamics, which, if he died suddenly, everything could throw the empire back into the civil wars it had just come out of. Not only was Mehmed worried, but the Janissaries, their numbers having grown now to some 5,000 or 8,000, depending on who you talk to. You also had the Ulma Qadis, and there were various other administrative and military leaders from all over the empire. And they were pressing the Sultan, beginning in 1417, to really start grooming the next leader. Feeling this pressure then, it was a good thing, too, that those close to Mehmed had that whole grim talk about life insurance, because in 1421, Sultan Mehmed I, the restorer of the Ottoman Empire, died in a riding accident while hunting. Oh, how the mighty falter under the mundane happenstance of history. Sometimes it's bee stings, or a general's jeep crashing into a truck. For Sultan Mehmed I, it was a hunting accident when he fell off his horse. His son Murad had his father's body carried in a litter from Edrine to Bersha for burial. Had any other man taken the Ottoman throne back in 1413, I'm not sure they would have done as good a job as Mehmed did. He took an empire with a shattered administrative structure, terrible diplomatic relations, one surrounded by hostile enemies, and an economy that was in tatters. In 8 short years, however, he put down rebellions, fought off enemies, and restored internal order. Not only that, but he brought along his own specific vision for the future. This vision included a revamped Janissary corps that would soon earn a fearsome reputation under his son Murad II, along with a highly efficient administrative system that would centralize the empire in decades to come. It's safe to say that had it been a lesser man to achieve the Sultanate after the empire's beating from Tamerlane years previous, the empire that would later conquer Byzantine in 1453 would not have survived for more than a decade the turmoil of those 8 years of Mehmed's I reign. That brings us now to Murad II, born in June 1404. The identity of his mother is under some dispute. According to Ottoman historian Sergulia, the prince's mom was a concubine, and still others place her as an important daughter of an Anatolian bey and hence a princess. What's even more bizarre is we have almost no public accounts of his rite of circumcision. If you check out the Women of the Ottoman Empire episode, you'd know what an important public event the circumcision of an Ottoman prince was. Murad first enters the historical record in 1410, when he was 6 years of age, and joined the official court of his father Mehmed. After 1413, the young boy, now 9 years old, was made the, picture some air quotes here, governor of Amiya province in Anatolia. We don't have very much in the way of what type of character or leader Murad was at this time, and this is totally understandable, given his age. But in 1416, Sultan Mehmed began laying the groundwork for Murad to eventually take the reins one day. This came in the appointment of Murad to important military units and missions. Again, because the historical record is sketch, we don't have much on what kind of action the young Murad must have seen. All we do know is that his posting put him into contact with some very important persons, mullahs, judges, and military leaders in charge of logistics in Anatolia. These connections would later serve him well when it was time to assert his own rule on down the line. Still, being a mere 13 or 15-year-old boy, the young Murad would find his actions constrained by an ever-increasingly powerful cadre of advisors who would maneuver to keep Murad as much as a figurehead as possible, both to avert possible disaster and also to help line their own pockets and otherwise serve their own selfish interest. At the tender age of 17, Murad was out hunting in the province of Amiya when word reached him of his father's death. This put the young prince in a precarious position immediately for two main reasons. First, Murad had not really had a chance to prove himself yet as a ruler worthy of the Sultanate. His father had kept him from any real danger, and his advisors, while assuring the prince's ego that, yes, you really are in charge of us, everyone knows that, Murad. The people around him, they weren't exactly thinking of him as a shot caller. His second biggest problem was that the Byzantine Emperor, sitting safe behind his Theodosian walls, still had an astounding 3, yes, you heard it right, 3 princes in his custody. And he was just waiting to play the Ottoman ascension game for as long as he wished. Murad knew that his first move had to be racing as fast as possible to the city of Bursa, still the Ottoman center of administrative and religious life. If he could make it there, he might be able to preempt Emmanuel from releasing one of his captive princes, along with the fistful of gold and band of mercenaries surely to follow. There was a lot on the line, including the European half of the empire. This is how vulnerable the Ottoman state was without a strong ruler at its head. However, channeling some of his late grandfather Bayezid through his veins, it is said that Murad stole out during the night, giving his smothering advisors the slip, and made it to Bursa, a grueling 2-day ride with very little rest and with a mere half-dozen of his closest friends for support and protection. Even as he arrived in the city, he couldn't be sure the mullahs or ortas, and the ortas, you'll recall, are like generals or field marshals of the Ottoman armies, would take to the young and untried prince. Heck, nobody would even recognize him. After spending a few days convincing the head judge in Sapiha that he was indeed Murad, his advisors finally caught up with him. The ortas of the Janissaries, the marshals of the Sapihas, the representatives of the various Ghazi warriors, and more importantly, the religious Islamic leaders from all over the empire. They eventually attended a ceremony which saw the prince girded with the sword of Osman, in which he became Sultan Murad II. It seemed like the memories of the Ottoman civil wars were still fresh in everyone's minds, and in those days nobody had the stomach for another fraternal bloodletting. We shall end our episode there. Next time we will go into the first reign of Murad II, which lasted from 1421 through 1444. And yes, you guessed it, his soon-to-be son is Mehmed II, the guy who took Constantinople. Oh boy, are we really almost upon that in the timeline? I can't wait. So, I'd like to offer an apology. I said I was going to pick this podcast up, and I kind of failed. It's been a year since my last episode was released, so a big I am sorry, and I won't do it again, for a third time anyway. With that said, episodes should be dropping every Tuesday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. and I hope to see you there. Thank you and goodbye.